Hi, my name is Brigette, and I hope that after watching this video you will know a little bit more about naming ionic compounds. Before we get into naming these compounds, I first want to review the basics of ionic bonding. Ionic compounds are composed of ions, which are charged particles that form when one atom or a group of atoms gain or lose electrons. A positively charged ion, called a cation, transfers a certain number of electrons to a negatively charged ion, called an anion, to form an ionic bond. I also want to review ionic charges. Group 1A metals, Group 2A metals, Group 17, 16, and 15, scandium, silver, zinc, aluminum, and cadmium all have fixed ionic charges. Their charges are +1, +2, -1, -2, -3, +3, +1, +2, +3, and +2 respectively. These charges will be important for balancing the chemical formulas of these compounds. In this video, I will talk about 5 configurations of ionic compounds. They can be formed between a metal and nonmetal, a metal and a polyatomic ion, a transition metal or post-transition metal and nonmetal, a transition metal or post-transition metal and a polyatomic ion, and 2 polyatomic ions. The naming of an ionic compound made up of a metal and nonmetal is quite easy. First, write the name of the cation and then the name of the anion, which usually ends in the suffix -ide. For example, let's look at NaCl. Break the compound into its individual ions and then name them. Here we have a sodium ion and a chloride ion. This compound is called sodium chloride. Before moving on to the next type of ionic compound, I have provided a chart listing the polyatomic ions and their charges that you'll need to memorize in order to master ionic nomenclature. To name an ionic compound consisting of a metal and a polyatomic ion, all you have to do is name the cation and then the polyatomic ion. Here we have CaSO4. First, identify the cation and anion and then name them. In this compound, we have a calcium ion and a sulfate ion, so the name of CaSO4 is calcium sulfate. Earlier, I only mentioned ions with one known ionic charge. However, some elements do form ions with multiple possible charges. These cases most commonly occur with the transition metals and post-transition metals. I have provided a list of the most common transition metals that form ionic bonds. These ions can be called by either their systematic names or common names. The naming of an ionic compound made up of a transition metal and a nonmetal or polyatomic ion is a little more difficult because you must figure out the charge of the cation. We will use the chemical formula of these compounds to decipher the charge of the cation. To name these compounds, write the name of the transition metal, the charge of the cation in parentheses, and then the name of the anion. You can always figure out the charge of the transition and post-transition metals if you know the overall charge of the compound and the ionic charge of the anion. Because we know the charge of the chloride ion in FeCl2 is -1 and there are 2 chloride ions in the compound, the charge of iron is +2 since the overall charge of the compound is 0. Thus, the name of FeCl2 is iron 2 chloride or ferrous chloride. When naming an ionic compound formed between a transition metal and a polyatomic ion, name the transition metal, then the charge of the cation, and then the name of the polyatomic ion. Here we have Cr3PO4-2. First, separate the compound into its individual ions. We know that the charge of PO4 is -3, and by looking at the chemical formula, there are 2 PO4 ions, so that ion has an overall charge of -6. The overall charge of the compound is 0, and because there are 3 Cr ions, that means the charge of each of those ions must be +2. We have a chromium ion with a charge of +2 and a phosphate ion, so the name of Cr3PO4-2 is chromium 2-phosphate or chromous phosphate. Naming an ionic compound formed from 2 polyatomic ions is very easy. All you have to do is name the compounds in the order they appear in the chemical formula. For example, NH4,2SO4 can be broken up into ammonium ions and a sulfate ion. Therefore, the name of this compound is ammonium sulfate. Here are some review questions that you can do to check your understanding of ionic nomenclature. Pause the video now, or I will reveal the answers in 3, 2, 1. I hope we answered all those questions correctly. Thanks for watching!